temperature difference when you stand right there.
Straight from
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear okay? The speakers, okay. So thank you again for coming to one of the Conesville Historical Society's programs. We are excited tonight to be hosting Jeff O'Connor, and he has brought with him a number of books. If you're interested in purchasing his books, you can talk to him about that. And he is known for a lot of things, these books, but also for his walking tours throughout Schoharie County. He does walking tours in like Middleburg, Cobleskill, Schoharie. I think I saw a bus trip that came about this year. So he's very well versed in this county and this area, and for that we are super excited to be hosting him. So thank you so much, Jeff. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's nice to, I don't often get a chance to come down this way. It's beautiful. Beautiful ride, even with the rain. I'm glad to be here. Now, I'm going to explain to you what the series is about. I'm going to talk mostly about the last volume, Volume 3, which is the current one that was just published a couple months ago. But hopefully you'll get a sense of where I'm coming from, but you're also going to get a real good sense of some of the things that people have accepted as Schoharie County history might be a little different now. Okay? So where this journey began was 13 years ago. It was the 300th anniversary of the Palatine arrival was fast approaching, which of course would have been 2012. And all I wanted to do was get a little pamphlet out, because I already had some stuff written about it, a little bit, and get a pamphlet out, add a few things that aren't generally known in the area. And one of the things that is about this history, and what it is really the foundational history of the Schoharie Valley, is that in the 17th century, which I have two books that are in that period, there are two documents, that's it. Two attempted land sales is all anybody knew about, and one was successful, one was not. There's no archaeological evidence of anybody occupying the Schoharie Valley during this period. So what do you do when you have like two documents and that's it, right? That's the end of the story. Well, most people hit brick walls for that. I, on the other hand, knew about something else too, and I was trying to find it. I had seen it, and I was trying to find it again, and it's one of many, many, many books in New York City history that I had downloaded, had it available. And I was trying to find it again because I was ready to use it. If anybody's ever researched New York City history, you know that there are literally dozens and scores and hundreds of histories on New York City. So I forgot which one it was. And this doesn't appear in any index either. It didn't make it easy. So what this letter is from January of 1695. And it is a letter from Nicholas Bayard, who was in the process of getting the patent for the Schoharie Valley. This is the successful attempt. And he's writing to Robert Sanders, a merchant in Albany, who was his eyes and ears up here, because Bayard lived in New York City. So what he's actually asking about is, you know, the land and at Schoharie. Okay? What he says that the land will be, I'm going to paraphrase here, the land will be good, fertile, great for improvement, as soon as the sand or silt disappears. Once it's gone from the overflow. Okay? What does that mean? This is the first documented flood in Schoharie County history that actually uses the term overflow, meaning flood, and Schoharie, or any variation of the name. 1695. Now, I already knew this existed. Now, I was all happy when I finally found this again after a couple of weekends looking for it. So I come down and I tell my wife, I found it, I'm jumping up for joy, right? You know what day it was? That day.
Oh my God.
Yeah. here I knew something that most people didn't know up here. The reason why that letter was in the book to begin with, or the history, is strictly because it had Bayard's autograph in it. So it didn't appear anywhere else. So yes, of course, I see it. This is the day that I found it. I knew we were dealing with at least a 300-year flood, if not longer. So, long story short, that little pamphlet started a little chain reaction in my head, and it's like, well, now there's another document that nobody really knew about the Schoharie Valley. Maybe there's more. Let's see what I can find. Okay. So what happened is, these 3 volumes were actually written as one large, very, very large book. And I had to break it apart to make it easier for me and anybody else trying to read it. That's a 13-year process from the little germination of this to the end. But really what it is, and what it ended up being, is about the network of people and events that are connected to the Schoharie Valley. Not necessarily that everybody saw it, but they had a hand in whether or not it was settled or not settled, or it had an impact on how it was used. And in the end, what really came out of this is, if you look over here and if you can see it, the first settlement, the first European settlement, is really 1614 in what we consider upstate New York. That would be Fort Nassau, near today's Albany and Fort Orange. And that's 1614. The next westward movement of any significance is 1661 at Schenectady. It's almost 50 years between them to go about 12 or 13 miles from the Hudson to the west. And then, of course, another 50 years later, you have the Palatines in 1712 come to the Schoharie Valley. And by 1723, within 10 years, because of the Palatines, they are now another 40 miles or so away from Schoharie, which really means it's about 80 miles. But the distance westward from the Hudson River, which took 50 years to happen because of the Palatines, again because of the Palatines, it doubled the western frontier. And that made a post out here in 1725 possible. And what this really is not, I kind of call this the book about the Palatines. That's not really about the Palatines. It's really a biography of the Schoharie Valley. But it's even bigger than that, because part of the way I approached this was to show how not just the Schoharie Valley was either discovered or talked about, or somebody related to it, but also the settlement patterns, to know how they worked and why maybe they didn't go forward and go that far west before 1712. But also a lot of it's about the Mohawks especially, but other native groups. So I use their voices throughout this entire series. And a lot of that is very enlightening as far as what they knew and what they thought about what was happening. But none of this happens, by the way, without the help and assistance of the Haudenosaunee, which are also called the Iroquois, or the 5 or 6 nations, and especially the Mohawks. None of this happens. Their part in this entire settlement pattern, and especially the Schoharie Valley, is critical. So, just to recap what Volume 1 is, I won't read all of these, but I'll leave it up enough if people can read it. You get prehistory, different archaeological evidence of what was and when things happened, how the Ice Age had shaped the valley, but also Dutch colonization. They're terrible at colonizing, good at making money. So that's one of the reasons why the Schoharie Valley wasn't settled prior to the Palatines. Explorers, missionaries, people who crossed the Schoharie Creek. The thing about New York history is they don't really talk much about the Schoharie Valley. If you look at any New York history book, the Schoharie Valley might show up maybe to talk about the Palatines for a second before they get to the Mohawk Valley, and then later on in the Revolution. But the fact is, the beaver trade that happened with beavers coming from Great Lakes or wherever, from the west, from the Haudenosaunee, also, they had to go by the Schoharie Creek. And it's such an important place, because it's a place they had to stop, cross, and go over in order to get to what is now Albany, for trade with the Dutch and later English. The rise of the Mohawks, their power, is shown. The English transition, which is bumpy ride, but then there's King Philip's War that engulfs all of New England, but also includes the Mohawk people. So the Mohawks are very connected to the Schoharie Valley, so of course I'm going to talk about what their outlook on life is also and what they got involved in. And then of course the discovery of the Schoharie Valley by the Europeans, and that is coincides with the Susquehanna being explored. And in the end, what this is really about with this book is heading toward this one, the first document that even mentions anything about Schoharie or any variation of the name. 1686, a guy by the name recorded as Brown was looking for land in Schoharie, 500 acres. And Schoharie is a very specific place on the creek. It was not known as the Schoharie Creek. In fact, later on it was known as Tyunder Rhodes Creek because there was a Mohawk settlement right next to it. And they were known as Tyunder Rhodes, so it's Tyunder Rhodes Creek. So this is a very specific place on the Schoharie Creek. And this was a brick wall to many historians, but in volume 1 where it ends, you find out that Brown is a misrecorded name, and the real name is Bounty. And even on this, letter up here, the name where it appears, it's nowhere near Brown. It's B-O-W-N with a slash meaning an E. It's just the way it was done in the colonial period when it was the end of a sentence. So it's very clearly Bounty. So what you get is a full biography of this man. I won't get into it too much here, but he ends up almost being the first governor of what we now call New Jersey. It was East and West Jersey. He almost became the first governor of the United New Jersey. But he didn't like the proprietors and they didn't like him. So that wasn't going to happen. But he has a very interesting life. Volume 2 kicks off with the Glorious Revolution in England. And of course what that means is war here between the French and Canada, English and New York, and it includes the Mohawks specifically. This is also when the Schenectady was burned and attacked, the so-called Schenectady Massacre. They also have the Leisler Rebellion. Very complicated subject. I'm not going to talk about it here, but I go into it in length in volume 1. But a lot of people who are connected to the Schoharie Valley, one of the approaches I took was get to know them when they first enter the documentary evidence. So you actually know who they are throughout this series. Adam Vroman is one of those who was throughout the entire series. Nicholas Bayard is another. And of course there are going to be more. But they have very critical parts to play in this rebellion. And the politics that occur after this, after Leisler surrenders and is hanged. So Mohawk villages are burned, but that's when, right after that, Nicholas Bayard gets his patent, and that's what that first letter was about. And the patent ends up being fraudulent. Two chiefs, Mohawk chiefs, come up and complain. One of them was named Hendrick, the other one Joseph. And they complained that 6 idle drunken of our people, while we were out fighting the French, they signed this patent, and it was fraudulent. Well, this patent ran for 30 to 40 miles from the mouth of the Schoharie all the way down south of what is now Vroman's Nose. It was never surveyed, so 30 to 40 miles, no idea how wide, maybe 2-3 miles wide, maybe more. But that fraud exposed a much greater fraud with other patents also. One of them was 70 miles along Lake Champlain and the Hudson Valley corridor. And what happens is if one person owns that much, it really slows down settlement because these folks are looking to make money. They're speculating, and they're not paying much. For instance, Nicholas Bayard only had to give 1 otter skin per year for that huge patent. Normally, it would be 2 shillings and 6 pence for every 50 acres. So, you know there's something wrong here. And what this does is it just sets the stage for why there was land available or land related to the Palatine story that's coming. And an interesting thing comes out of the Leisler Rebellion is that Robert Livingston, who is one of the wiliest operators in New York, he gets involved with Captain Kidd. Yes, that Captain Kidd, and is involved in piracy. And Nicholas Bayard has a role to play in that also. Things you don't necessarily equate to Schoharie County history, but there is definitely connections, including one where Captain Kidd supposedly buried part of his treasure in Gilboa, right next door. Don't get too excited because I put a big pin in that balloon by following what actually happened. But it's an interesting story nonetheless. And of course, Volume 2 ends with the Mohawks returning to the Schoharie Valley. Most of the 17th century, nobody was living in the Schoharie Valley. Mohawks returned, probably related to a new war that was forming in Europe. And as they are trying to position themselves properly, it looks like they had a remote settlement out here for various purposes. And this is a view from the Onisagarawa, which the Mohawks would call Drummond Snows. And right here is the old oxbow that was there. We can talk about that later. Schoharie traditionally has been known and derived from driftwood. Mohawks today take it from a word called Ilo Schoharie, and that means cleansing or a place of cleansing. Very briefly, what they would do is come here, the clay, the alluvial soil has a lot of clay in it. And alluvial soil is deposited from the Ice Age, so there's a lot of clay there. And they would come here, and they would just cover their bodies with it. So when they washed it off in their world and their culture, it would wash away all the toxins and bad things in their system. So this is one of, more than likely, several reasons why they thought the Schoharie Valley was sacred. They still do today. So, Volume 3, mostly dealing with the Palatines. The story starts in Europe. I'll just introduce these 3 folks. On the left is Sarah, Duchess of York. In the middle is Queen Anne, and on the right is John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, one of my favorite historical figures. He gets involved, and the reason why I start here with this book, and I really get into the march, what they call the March to the Danube, which is really the Blenheim campaign. Now, Blenheim, obviously nearby Blenheim, was called after this place in battle. However, it's more important to the story that Marlborough marches through the Palatinate in order to get there. And he actually says it is the one of the most beautiful places he's ever seen. And of course, he's writing back to Sarah, his wife, Sarah, who has the Queen's ear because it's her closest friend and confidant. So this may be around 1704 when the whole idea of the Palatine started forming in Queen Anne's mind from letters being sent back and forth. But it's also a good place to really dive into who Colonel Robert Hunter was. Now, in the Palatine story, a lot of these folks, like Colonel Hunter, Adam Vroman, Livingston, all these guys, they're painted as the enemy to the Palatines. They're painted as the people standing in their way. One of the reasons why I wanted to really introduce these folks, well, in the first time they come up in the documentation, is so you get to know them before you know the Palatines. So you come up with an idea of who these people are before they're really painted in a corner about who they are according to the Palatine side of the story. Some turn out to be exactly who you think they are, some don't. But it's interesting. And Hunter, very quickly, was on the campaign with Marlborough to Blenheim. In fact, he became a decorated lieutenant colonel of a dragoon outfit. And he was also a very close aide and confidant of Marlborough, who eventually makes it possible for Hunter to become the governor of New York. So, I talked about the extravagant grants, and this will show what those really were. This is the Schoharie Valley here, a little green light. This is on the Mohawk, about 50 miles long. This is the 70-mile long one along Lake Champlain and the Hudson. And then there's this small one here, down around Newburgh. Now, this might get a little complicated. 1699, the extravagant grants here were vacated, meaning they're broken up, never happened, they're annulled. Just like a bad marriage, right? So then you have to ask the question, do they go back to the Mohawks who sold it, or does it go back to the Queen? Very interesting. I don't know that I can tell you that. I can only tell you how people reacted after this. So, vacated 1699. 1702, because of the politics of the day, the new party comes in, and that's what the Leeser Rebellion was so important, because followers of him would have power, and then the other side would have power, then the other one. So somebody else comes in, 1702, and they have another active assembly that reverses the other one. The problem is that it requires the king or queen, and at this time it's the Queen Anne, it requires them to confirm an active assembly in the colonies. You probably don't even know much about what's going on, other than here, you need to sign this, and this briefly is what it's about. So here we go to 1708, and all of the available land in the so-called province of New York is really in Mohawk territory now, just outside of it, most of it, is not available to settle. So what does Queen Anne do with the first 51 Palatines under Joshua Cotterell? What does she do in order to have land for them to go to? And they were supposed to produce naval stores, just like the ones we're familiar with that come. And there's no place to put them. So she confirmed the first act. Don't worry, there's no test at the end. So she confirmed the first act, which meant all of those big extravagant grants are now broken up. They revert back to the original owners. Like I said, who's the original owner now? So what does that mean? Well, on that small tract on the Hudson here, used to be owned by a guy by the name of Captain Evans. That is where they decided to plant the first colony of Palatines in New York under Cotterell. And that's right around Newburgh. So, these four chiefs, most Mohawk, one was a River Indian, which I explain in the books what River Indians and who they were. There is a story, there's this big myth, that these four chiefs, who are called four kings, went to England, saw the Palatines in the camps near London, took pity on them, and said, "We have land for you in the Schoharie Valley." Let's explore that for a moment. I'm not going to talk much about in England, because what happens is I get off on tangents, and we're going to be here all night. So even with the cushions on the pews, you might not want to be here till midnight. So I'm going to blow the myth here, and that is that the chiefs met them in London. Well, the chiefs left Boston in February of 1710. The Palatines who came here, the 3,000 or so, that got on ships. They were on ships from Christmas or thereabouts in 1709. They were on the southern coast of England for several months. They put into Portsmouth Harbor, which is a picture here, and they were there in April. Now, those chiefs came over starting in February and made it to Portsmouth Harbor April. So the only time they could have conversed is at Portsmouth Harbor. The problem is they were on ships and nobody debarked to talk to each other, mainly because nobody thought the Palatines were worth it. And if they had met each other, the Palatines were already suffering from typhus and other rodent-borne diseases, meaning some were already dying on these ships. If they had met those kings, whether in the camps, where there were other camp diseases, or on the ships, the chiefs probably would have died. So that's probably the first piece of evidence that they never met them in Europe. But I'll explain what happened there. So Palatines finally go, and as you know, 470 die along the way in the Atlantic. Terrible conditions. And then they land on Governor's Island, which is the island in front of Manhattan. And that's where another 250 died, according to the number of boards and nails that were purchased for people who were dying on the island. And eventually, they make their way up to, give you an idea about New York, where we are talking about here. This is Livingston Manor here. New York City, of course, is down here. Governor Hunter, while they're at Governor's Island, the Palatines are recuperating. What he does is he sends out surveyors to the Schoharie and Mohawk valleys, and also the Hudson. What he's looking for are pitch pine trees for the naval store operation that he is now in charge of as the new governor to make sure that it happens. These 3,000 Palatines, now a lot less because a bunch of them died. There's only about 2,200 left to actually go up to Livingston Manor to start this process. These are the only Palatines who were sent anywhere under contract to produce the naval stores, which causes problems. Governor Hunter's going to make sure they're fed, they get ale and beer. They're going to get that from Livingston, one of the only people in the province who can actually handle that kind of logistics. And then they'll get their meat from New York City. But here's the problem. This is where the story really generates, where the Mohawks gave land to the Palatines. On the left is Colonel Hunter. On the right is Hendrick. He was one of the chiefs who complained about the Bayard patent. But Hendrick was also one of the chiefs that went to London. And when he came back, he found out that Governor Hunter had sent out surveyors into the Schoharie and Mohawk valleys without their permission. In fact, those surveyors were kicked out by the Mohawks a couple of times and finally relented. But when Hendrick found out, he was so upset, he had a meeting with Governor Hunter in August 22nd, 1710. This is after he returns from London. And Hendrick chastises him. Says you had no permission to send surveyors out to the Schoharie Valley. And that's one thing. But he's a good orator, and he knows he's going to get something from the governor, which is, he can't jeopardize that relationship. It means too much as far as material goods, trade. This is where they're going to get their weapons and everything that goes along with it, but also annual gifts to renew their friendship. So he can't go too far. So what he does is he gives them the highball up here, chastise them. Then down here comes the offer. We'll give the land to the Christians, meaning the Palatines, for their use. We'll give it to Queen Anne for their use. We reserve the flat or plain where we still plant corn near the Onondaga, again, Romans knows. So what Hunter does, he already knows by this time, Schoharie, Mohawk valleys, they don't have the type of trees that are needed. So he doesn't say anything. He just accepts this. And he's Queen Anne personified, which means he has the ability now to sell it to whoever he wants to. He's never going to give it to poor people. And by the way, they're contracted to make naval stores. They haven't even started that yet. So Hunter holds on to that, and he contracts with Livingston in order to get the land for the camps. And just so you know, Hudson's over here, the camps are around here, and the Livingston Manor is actually up here. Interesting to note that it was believed that Livingston would be the only one that makes out in this whole deal, mainly because his land is going to be improved with roads, bridges, docks, all this apparatus that they're going to need. And it kind of turned out to be true. And he didn't have to do anything like he usually does, being wily and getting his way and really being underhanded. He doesn't have to do that. It's already all set. So in the spring of 1711, after the Palatines built their first huts, out in the 7 camps. 1711, they start stripping trees. They stripped about 100,000 or so. Problem is, it's a 2-year process. When they strip them, the bark has to face a certain way. This is their way of dealing with it. And this is the process, so it has to go through 2 of each season in order for the sap to collect properly. So they cut that part, and if they're going to burn it, they're going to make tar, which is good for waterproofing the ship's rigging, or other resins, which help caulk wood and for other purposes. The only thing produced out of this whole thing was 200 barrels of tar that was burned from pine knots that they sent the children out to go get in order to keep them busy. That's it. Because by 1712, things are going to change. But in between that, if they ever mention that there's better land somewhere else in this whole process, now in 1710 we know Hendrick gave Hunter, or at least Queen Anne, the use of their land for the Palatines in the Schoharie Valley. And they had a garrison. Palatine men were in the Albany garrison throughout the winter. They could have learned about Schoharie from there. But another time they could have learned it was the 1711 expedition to Canada. And it was aborted near Lake George. It never happened, but they marched. 300 of them were volunteers. Because whenever they mentioned anything about better land in Schoharie, Hunter would come back and say, well, I can't protect you out there from the enemy. They could attack and I can't protect you. There's no forts. I don't have the men. I don't have anything for you. So, in their minds, if they join this expedition and defeat the French in Canada, they can have the Schoharie land for themselves. Now, it wasn't never going to be that simple, and nobody ever told them that's what it was, but 300 of them volunteered. But when they came back, what they found is that their families weren't taken care of. The meats and other victuals the quality was deteriorating, nobody was taking care of their families, and it was the beginning of a problem for Hunter, because the initial money sent out to them was given by Whig reformers in London. The Whigs are the reformers. Queen Anne was totally on board with this, kind of looked at them as her children. But the problem is in 1711, a Tory government comes into play, and they're not going to keep this operation going. They think it's, why spend charity on them when we got people at home? It gets complicated, but what happens is Hunter ends up actually using his own credit and money, and by the fall of 1712, it's running out. So much so, Hunter's afraid of going to debtor's prison if he's no longer governor. That's how bad it was. So, what that sets up is, in the fall of 1712, Hunter tells the Palatines there, fend for yourselves, shift for yourselves, they tell them. Well, there's a certain number of families who are the farmer class who always thought now, and as we're heading toward this and everything's becoming worse as far as food and whatnot, they know that Schoharie, or Schoharie as it's really being called at the time, that is their salvation. That's their promised land out there. Between them was the Catskill Mountains, but that's where they wanted to go. It wasn't everybody in the camps, but it was a certain number. And of course, the leader of all this was Johann Conrad Weiser. So right up until 1712, between 1711 and 1712, there were little rebellions on Livingston Manor. Palatines would rise up even with their muskets, trying to get by force what they couldn't get through persuasion by different shows of force. So there's a cat and mouse game between them and Hunter. But in the end, they're told to shift themselves. They've got to stay in the province. Schoharie's not in the province. It's still in Mohawk territory. Hunter had not yet sold it. So what does this group do? They send out scouts. One of the first places that they would see coming into the Schoharie Valley from Albany along the foot trail over the Helderbergs would be this mountain, known today as Terrace Mountain. It was known as One Keats Eno by the Mohawks. A very small Mohawk community lived on the eastern side, or toward us in the picture, of the Schoharie Creek. Was known as Escahir. It was about 40 people, not 40 warriors, but 40 people. And a chief chief by the name of Ezra, or Sonaway, also known as Ezra, was there, and he was involved in some of the land sales around the Schoharie Valley eventually. And there was a attempted land sale in 1710 that didn't materialize. So of course, the Palatines see this. The name for the mountain is hard or rocky in Mohawk. And the Palatines called it Clippeberg, which is also rocky, but more like in the sea, which kind of fits because this is kind of on like an island by itself out there. When you look at it coming down I-88 or Route 7. So they know that this land is going to be very fertile. They like it, and they decide to act on things. One of the things that happens, this is the Mohawk River. This is the mouth of the Schoharie here. You have Fort Hunter over here, and you have Tyunda Road here. That's why this is called Tyunda Roads Creek, or sometimes the Undeloja, and other variations. What happens is that Johann Conrad Weiser takes 50 families to Schenectady, and that's going to be their forward base. If you look at it from a military viewpoint, what you have is an advanced guard for the rest of them. They're the ones who are going to blaze the trail, so to speak. So they're in Schenectady. They clear a road at least 15 miles to the Schoharie Valley. This is not a road, by the way, used for people to walk to the Schoharie Valley. They could have done that without it. There's enough Indian trails out there. What it was anticipating in the spring that Johann Conrad Weiser, who is in Schenectady throughout the winter, is going to provide livestock, food, wagons for everything, and be able to start settling the next year. So that first 50 families from Schenectady, they go to the Schoharie Valley with not much more than cornmeal, and they set up in their first settlement. But while that's happening, in early November, there's a new missionary, William Andrews, that comes to Albany. There's a very large Mohawk delegation there, and they escort him through Schenectady to Tyunda Road. And that's where little Conrad Weiser, Weiser's son, is, his father requests that the son goes with this delegation. So that's how he ends up at Tyunda Road. And this is where he learns the culture of the Mohawks, the language, so that's how he becomes an interpreter. And that's the fall of 1711. Now getting back to roads, there's a sign. This sign is over on 146 as you're heading through Guilderland to the Guilderland Center, and then soon you're going to be in Guilderland. So this is the Palatine Road. It says, first road west by German refugees to Schoharie Valley. There's historians out there that think the first road was what is now 146. It's not. The first road, you look at one, you probably won't be able to see the dotted lines here, but if you look at one, that's the first road. Here's Schenectady to the right. That's the Schoharie Valley down here. This is Albany here. So the first road is Schenectady to Schoharie Valley. That's number one. And number two is a road that they cleared later in a document that comes up in 1723 or 1720 about a second road they could make to Albany for better communication. So the sign is where that big S is, that red S, right here. Little off. But these are the kinds of things that need to be addressed. And there's another one. Weisershore being in Middleburg. Eventually it was. The sign says founded 1712-13 by John C. Weiser, of course. He did not in 1712. The first settlement, and I'll explain, the first settlement of those first 50 folks, 50 families, was actually in Brunendorf, which would be where the 1743 parsonage is, in the village of Schoharie. And I'll explain. One of the, in most early histories of Schoharie County, Brown, Sims, Roscoe, they talk about the dwarfs and they list them in order from the south to the north. So you have Weisersdorf being in the south. They call that the first settlement. Then you have Hartmannsdorf going north. A couple miles from there, you have Brunendorf. Then you have Schmitzdorf. Then you have Foxesdorf, where the old stone fort is today. And then you have Gerlachsdorf across the creek from that. Then there is Niskirnsdorf. And they all, that's what they say. So, of course, the impression is that there's one Weisersdorf, and that started it, and it was an orderly fashion going down. Well, it was nothing like that. Not all families came in 1713. We hear, 150 families came in 1713. They didn't. There were about another 70 families, and then over the course of the next few years, then it became another 120 families. So it was kind of helter-skelter a little bit, but we also can't assume that they all had separate homes either. Probably lived communally. Certain families were in one house and whatnot, so there were families that could spread out. And that's exactly what happened. But let me tell you about the only primary source document there is about the dwarfs. You don't see them on any maps. They're always done by the English, so they're always English names, like Foxestown, Weiserstown, whatever. Only primary source document comes from Conrad Weiser Jr. This is later in life. He's the interpreter now for Pennsylvania. And he talks about the dwarfs from north to south. Already he's establishing something different. First one, Niskirnsdorf. Everybody agrees on that one. Next one, Gerlachsdorf. Everybody agrees. Fuchsdorf. Everybody agrees on that one. Gerlachsdorf. Everybody agrees. Then you got Fuchs. Then you've got Schmitzdorf. Everybody agrees that. Then he says, Weisers or Brunendorf. Now, Brunendorf stuck. Weisers did not. And that should tell you right there, that suggests that Weisers came before Brunen. The reason why the first Weisersdorf was here is, number one, it's named after the guy who brought him this far, who's still in Schenectady, by the way. He's not living here. So they named the Dorf after him, Dorf meaning a small village. They name it after him, and what happens is that becomes something different once people move. And what I haven't said yet is the next Dorf down south is Hartmannsdorf. The other last Dorf is Oberweisersdorf. So now he's talking about two Weisersdorfs. Ober is a word, German word for upper. So it's on the upper part of the valley. That works good. That works fine. What other Ober also means is it's a sign of respect. So if somebody has a high position in the town, let's say a magistrate, just like Johann Conrad Weiser was, you would call them Ober, like Oberweiser. Okay? So this is another reason to think this came later. In fact, when it gets down to it, and I make the argument in Volume 3, is that I believe what people think is Weisersdorf in Middleburg was really the last of the Palatine dwarfs, possibly as late 1714, which contradicts what's out there. But I explain it further in those books. And there's a 1743 parsonage. The springs in which Brunendorf is named after, Brunen meaning spring, later known as Fountaintown, and then later Schoharie, are on the left of the photograph in a limestone hill. That's where they got their water. It's a perfect spot for them in the winter. They don't have to go down to the creek, which is a good 1.5 miles away from this point. They don't have to worry about flooding. It's a great place to be. So the repositioning here. Central Bridge, Niskirnsdorf, Gerlachsdorf, Escahier is right here just to the north of the creek. Ponticiano, Terrace Mountain, Fuchsdorf, Schmitzdorf, and Schoharie, Weisers, then later Brunendorf. You lose the Weisers name because the Weisers are now live later in Oberweisersdorf. So you have to drop the Ober too because there's only one Weisersdorf after that. Hartmannsdorf, Oberweisersdorf, Onestegrawa, Wildenderhoek, which is the small community of Mohawks that consolidated there after the Palatines arrived, because the Palatines needed more land, so they bought it with 300 pieces of aid. And they spread out from what is now Schoharie. And what happens is that small community of Escahare consolidates with the very small community of just a couple of Mohawk families at the base of Onistagarawa. And that becomes one consolidated community. Very small, but important. And that would have been around 1714. Now the circle part here is Adam Groman's patent. And Adam Groman becomes an antagonist in the Palatine story. We all know this. Palatines think he's a spy. There is a, what some believe that Conrad Weiser, when he finally arrives in what would be Oberweiser's store, he starts telling the natives, the Mohawk people, and by the way, it's just Mohawks. The only thing talked about contemporarily there are a few family of Mohawks. There's no Mohegans, there's nobody else there, like said in Brown. That's a much later thing that I explained in volume 2. So anyway, you have Adam Groman here, and the Weisers, really his father, because Conrad Weiser always said, you know, I'm my father's son, meaning he had to do anything his father said. He's living with him still. So he tells the Mohawks that Groman cheated him. Groman had 2 patents that were consolidated as 600 acres in 1714, and he started bringing his sons down and workmen, slaves, in order to establish a house there. And this becomes a bone of contention. Palatines don't want him there. Now, in 1714, what also happens is that the partners, first 5 and later 7, purchase the land out from under the Palatines from Governor Hunter. Governor Hunter stands to make money. He's part of the legal bribery that there is. He gets a certain fee for putting his name and giving the seal on the wax that holds the patent. So he gets a certain amount of money for all this. So the thing about the supposed fraud, and Conrad would tell the Mohawks, well, it's much bigger than 600 acres. Mohawks didn't care. They really didn't. But because Weiser was persistent and he knew how the culture worked, he could work on other fears. That's probably what was more of a thing. If anybody, Adam Groman defrauded the province. Now with Mohawks, when you're looking at land, you go from here to there to there to there to certain landmarks. And that doesn't change. It doesn't matter if you call it 500 acres or 5,000. It's the same. But here's the deal. Remember what I told you about that otter skin that Bayard had? That was one otter skin. It's supposed to be 2 shillings and 6 pence for every 50 acres. And of that, you got to cultivate like 3 of them by the first year. Well, Adam Groman, having 600 acres, wasn't surveyed properly, so he's only paying what we call that quit rent. It's basically a tax. He's paying that only on 600 acres, not 1,100 that it turned out to be when it got resurveyed. So if anybody's being defrauded, it's the province. But he went to the extreme to actually have it surveyed, and he actually paid the Mohawks again a second time. So they were pretty happy in the deal, and in the end they just said, however many acres it is, we really don't care. We're no surveyors. And that's really what this was all about. Of course, by that time, Weiser was, most of the Palatines had already left. But something that comes out of this is pretty interesting. Is a boundary marker for the first Palatine purchase of land in 1723. And they call it the Athgabalan Bergen. I'm loosely defining it as Falls of the Mountain. Now, the Mohawks call this Bouts Falls. They call it White Spout in their language. So Bouts Falls today, there's 3 different names for it. And the only place where Athgabalan Bergen shows up is in this one particular land sale. Haven't found it anywhere else. Very interesting that it was just a local name for it. Of course, beautiful picture of Roman's nose, about what it looks like. Now, the thing about Groman is that he is readily available for the Palatines to try to force him out because they fear his nearness, that, again, he's going to be a spy, he's going to do all these things to him. So they can get their hands on him and his family. He can't get their hands on the partners who live in Albany, or even some in New York City. So they can't really do anything there. The partners tried to come to terms with them, rent, buy, or leave. That didn't work. They tried it a couple of times. And finally, because Weiser's son and others are tearing Vroman's sons off the wagons, beating them, running livestock over the fields after Vroman sows his fields. And then Weiser would run to the local Mohawks and get help to do that. So it was a bad situation. And Vroman is complaining about this. He made two complaints. One was a little bit more descriptive. And this is the complaint about his houses being dragged down. And eventually a warrant's out for Johann Conrad Weiser's arrest. And a posse sent out. They can't find him. They sent out a guy by the name of Adams. They call him a high sheriff. There are no sheriffs or constables named Adams in the 18th century in the province of New York. So what he was probably a hired hand who could speak the language, or at least well enough Dutch that they could communicate with each other. So he goes down to Oberweisersdorf, and normally you just tack something up and you leave. Problem is there's no public buildings to tack it up. Who's in there in town are the women. The women are around the houses, men are out in the fields. So of course when this guy says rent, buy, or leave, get out or pay, women, they've had enough. Every stop along the way they lost somebody. The leader of this group who tore the Adams off the horse, Magdalena Z, lost 2 children along the way. Others also lost children, husbands, brothers, whatever. So they had enough. They don't want to go anywhere. So they tear them off the horse, ride them on a rail for every pigsty and mud hole for a good 5 miles up to what is now Fox Creek. And on a little feeder stream, there is a little bridge, footbridge. This is where supposedly Magdalena Z took out a rail, broke 2 ribs, poked an eye out of Adams, and then squatted down and relieved herself in the socket. Thinking they left him for dead, he crawls off over the Heldenbergs. He's finally taken to Albany by someone with a wagon. Things are kind of quiet for a little while. There is a law against plowing in the valley, which sets everybody off, but they're powerless to do anything. But eventually, small groups of people, mostly women, who did the damage to Adams, not the men. Men are scared of going. The women are not. It tells you, about Palatine women, right? Not to be messed with. So anyway, these small groups become larger, and eventually there's a posse waiting for them in Albany, and many of these folks are thrown in a dungeon, and in order to get out, either they or their husbands or whoever had to sign either say rent from the partners, buy land from them, or get out. And that's how many of them left. Conrad Weiser Jr. was one of them. This is just before he gets married. He ends up apparently getting a 10-year lease. This is what Governor Hunter said that he was being offered. A 10-year lease, no quit rent. They don't have to pay anything to anybody for 10 years. But after that, they got to pay a quit rent of 2 shillings and 6 pence. That's it, for 50 acres. So that was a pretty good deal. However, in the meantime, and I'll just show you this real quick. You probably can't see much of this. This is a map of the Vroman's land. And the most important part about this is that here is the Dovegot that used to be there in Oxbow. And Indian Village is on one side, burial place on the other. And you have parcels out here starting in 1716 that Adam Vroman started parceling out. And an interesting thing I found was, now Kerry Godante is the supposed first Mohawk that came to the valley. We know that's not true because he was one of the first of the latest group, or the last group to get there. But he's kind of an elusive figure outside of deeds. Well, here's something very interesting. And one of those parcels that Vroman was breaking up, about a certain number of rods, it's described, is Kerry Donkey's house. Obviously Kerry Godante, right? This is 1716. This is not a deed. This is a deed, but it has nothing to do with Kerry Godante other than saying where he lives. And also near there is a stump, and that stump is probably that stamp block that everybody talks about with the Palatines, where the Mohawks and the Palatines used as a mortar and pestle in order to crush down corn and other grains. So right there is something that is far more substantial than anything written in the early histories, which is really hearsay, written to begin with 100 years after the fact. So that's interesting. And this is more of a an idea about what that one map was that we couldn't really see very well. Here you have the Dove God, probably a corruption of Ubak, which is one of the words in Dutch for oxbow. You got the Mohawk village over here, just toward the creek side of the oxbow, which was much larger at the time. The channel is here, Schoharie Creek here and there, and this is where the Mohawks wintered. Now another part of this story, and I'm kind of skipping over the delegation that went to London. Basically, three men, including Johann Conrad Weiser, went to London, tried to get redress, tried to keep staying in the Schoharie Valley. They didn't get what they wanted. They got a sympathetic ear, though, and Governor Hunter went to London also to defend himself, but he switched places with William Burnett, so now Hunter became part of the Treasury, and Burnett becomes the new governor, and the new governor is told, if anybody wants to stay in the province of New York, find land for them and make it happen. It's actually a very generous offer considering what else has been going on. But make sure that if they stay, they are part of this. They have to rent, buy, or leave. They got to go somewhere else. They can't stay in the Schoharie Valley and have land given to them. So, that said, part of the Exodus, starting in 1723, is the 15 or 16 families that go up Summit Lake to Charlotte Creek, and they make dugout canoes out of the trees there in the spring of 1723, when the water's high. And on this map, where that red circle is, this is a map of 1778. However, people living in the Schoharie area, many of them were Palatines who descended from Palatines who remained behind. They didn't go anywhere. They just made deals with the partners, or otherwise bought other lands. The canoe place was still well known, where they cut the trees for those dugout canoes. So on this map of 1778, that red circle actually says canoe place. That's what they mean. So it's a bit up on the Charlotte Creek, but probably a place they could put the canoes in where it was high but not turbulent, so they could control it, so they could load it with provisions and whatnot. And the logistics of this had to be enormous. So also in 1722, Lieutenant Governor Keith from Pennsylvania comes up. They have a meeting in Albany, and Conrad Weiser Jr. is there. Now his father, after leaving England, he's kind of a nomad. Nobody really knows exactly what he was doing. Maybe he was, out toward the Hudson or whatever. But in 1722, Governor Keith, he's the one who basically invites Palatines to go down to Pennsylvania. So the ones that end up in Tulpehocken are taking Governor Keith's word that they'll be welcome there. The problem is, guess what? Governor Keith has his own agenda. It's about speculation and other things. The natives were living there who were Delaware or Muncie. They didn't much appreciate the fact that this had happened. So of course they get themselves into another land argument down in Pennsylvania that's not resolved for another decade. That's not until Conrad Weiser Jr. finally gets down there in 1729. And by 1732, it's finally resolved in a different way than Hunter did. Hunter could have done different things. He could have given them better land. He had some of the best farmers in Europe. Give them the land that they say is good instead of the land you're telling them is good. And you're not listening to what they're saying. There's many ways he could have handled it. But the way it was handled in Pennsylvania tells you the difference between leaders. One being very imperial, Hunter. Very intelligent, well-read, literature, science, all of that. But he was very imperial in his view. You do it my way, and that's the way it's going to be. The Penn family, however, this is even after William Penn died, they made it so that they satisfied the local natives as far as goods and other materials for the land that these folks were on. So they directly interceded and made a peaceful solution to it because, of course, the Palatines are looked at as a valuable resource. It's going to help the province. Now, before I do that, I got to go back a little bit. Now, after that also, by 1723, men come back from London. They don't live very long, other than Conrad Weiser. But it's enough to say, we're not going to get what we want. So when Governor Burnett offers land, he offers land out in the German Flats area around Herkimer, right here. And at first there's interest, but then the interest wanes. Now, there's a belligerent group here in the Schoharie Valley, and then there's a not so belligerent group. And then there's a group that didn't want any part of what the Weisers were doing. Adam Broman actually mentioned that this group was threatened, the peaceful one, was threatened with their houses being burned by Weiser. So this group I call the non-belligerent group. As things were going on with the German Flats, people were kind of wavering about going there. Burnett was smart. He kind of researched a little bit about who these people were. And he offered this non-belligerent group, because other ones were saying, I don't know, it's not great land over there in the German Flats, blah, blah, blah. He offered this group, the non-belligerent group, land. If they wanted to leave the Schoharie Valley, they didn't want to come to terms with the partners. I'll find land for you in the Mohawk Valley, and you can pick it out. This is the difference. This is a new tag. You can pick it out. It just can't be bottomland. You can pick it out. So 27 families end up in Stone Arabia. They picked that land. Burnett made it happen. Now he goes back to the other group. He goes, see what you can get when you play nice? So at first, they're all, they're giddy. They're going to get something. But then they start wavering again. So only a couple of families from the Schoharie Valley end up in the German Flats. But it's starting in 1722, when all of this was developing, new ships come in New York City, and many people from the Palatinate and other surrounding principalities end up going there, including the Herkimer family. So that gets settled that way. So that is the 1723 by the German Flats that pushes that western frontier out and basically doubles the western frontier as far as the land mass go. Now, what happens with the folks in Schoharie? Well, of course, the church is someplace that people can gather around, right? I have a very interesting story about a lay preacher who would give services in both Lutheran and Dutch and German Reform, and commingle all these things. He didn't really have a hard grasp on which one was which, and it caused problems. And originally he had a problem in New York City, so much so that when he gave a sermon, he wanted to do another one. So all the deacons of the church got together and literally boarded up the stairs to the pulpit, which would be a higher pulpit, and literally blocked it with their bodies to keep him from saying anything at the next service. Von Duren. Crazy story. And, oh, by the way, somebody writing about him in his thing is John Peter, I can't believe I have a breakdown here. John Peter Zenger. Interesting guy. Everybody thinks he's the beginner of the whole idea of First Amendment rights, right? Freedom of the press. Well, he was an apprentice to William Bradford. And I talk about William Bradford, I believe it's in the second volume. And he's really the first one. He goes on trial for the exact same thing that Zenger did about, contradicting the governor or a high official. And Bradford actually was his own lawyer. And it's so funny because he knew the laws better than all of the other barristers and the judge. So you can see it, and he's just like, well, the law says this, the law says this, and they're basically scratching their heads. And, really? So he ran around him, and that's, I'm sure, where Zenger got his ideas about the thing that I briefly talked about with Governor Cosby. So churches start bringing people together. The Dutch and the Germans, they kind of stay separate, but one of the things that really brought people together is number one, the King's Highway. You probably can't see it very well. But the King's Highway was a thought in 1722 to build one for better communication. And it didn't happen until 1727. This is after many Palatines had already left, whether it's to Toplahaken in Pennsylvania or to the Mohawk Valley. Now with the road, which has to be confirmed by the king or queen, and this time it's a king, that's what's called a King's Highway, that's really all that means. What happens is everybody who lives along where the road's going to be, they have to turn out and help clear it first, and then every year they got to come out when called by the superintendent of the roads and repair it. So what happens is you have Dutch who are now coming into the Schoharie Valley, taking up all those approved lands that the Palatines had. Also, Adam Broman has brought nephews and sons and grandsons in. So now they are working essentially for the same purpose. Same thing happens with the militia. They have to work together in order to be now coming under the provincial fold. Part of that is militia service. You're compelled to do it when you become 16. So now you actually have Dutch and Palat and Germans working together. And this really sets the stage for what happens later when they are working together in prosperity, and then, of course, the Revolution and beyond. Okay, getting toward the end here. Up here on the Mohawk, Schoharie Valley's down here in the lower right. The Mohawk Valley up here, this is where Conrad Weiser obtains land in 1729. That's the same year that he actually goes down to Pennsylvania and lives. Maybe it was for his father, hard to say. There's no records of it. And also Hartman Windecker in 1731 moves from the Schoharie Valley, and he moves to the Mohawk Valley just across the creek from Canajoharie. And that's where 1731 really comes from, because that's the last significant exodus of the Palatines. So, where does Weiser go? This is Pennsylvania. And he's at Walmelsdorf, right around here. Warnersville around here. There's actually a Warnersville there, just like Warnerville near Cobleskill, right? I actually did a talk down there a few weeks ago. And I go, it came a long way. You used to go to 1 mile to Warnerville, because it's literally 1 mile away from my house. But anyway, this is where they ended up as Toplahaken Valley. About 80 families by 1727. And with Conrad Weiser, he becomes through a chance encounter with Shikellamy, a Oneida chief. And he also became very friendly with a Munsee or Delaware chiefs there. And he becomes the interpreter for Pennsylvania. And this is, if you've never been down that way, this is his house in Walmelsdorf. I would say probably about an hour away from Reading. And that's where his site is. Now to sum everything up, Palatines, I didn't talk about this much, but the Palatines basically came here because they became refugees in their own land. Through the war of the Spanish Succession, the one that Marlborough went through with Blenheim, French armies would come across the Rhine and just raid, just very much like the raids here in the Revolution in the Schoharie County. And one of these raids was the 1707, 1708. It's a year-long raid. Burning homes, crops weren't able to be planted. By the time 1709 happened, people were starving, people were dying. Bread was really expensive, and they still had to pay taxes to the feudal landlord. So things weren't good for a lot of them. So 13,500 eventually ended up in England. But they came because of war. You could say religion in a broad scheme, where it was Protestant against Catholic, but they were allowed to, as far as in their principality, they were allowed to worship as they please, regardless of any law about they have to do it as their elector Palatine would be. So if the elector Palatine was Catholic, in theory, you're supposed to be Catholic also. Nobody enforced that. But that was about war. Now, to end everything and sum it up, you may know these people, you probably don't. These are two Mohawk coming down to the Schoharie Valley for well over a decade now. And they can trace their ancestry to the Schoharie Valley. Now, we all know the Revolution, many of the Mohawks and other groups were forced out. Some stayed, by the way. Some actually fought on the side of the militia and the, who we call the Americans now. They weren't all British. So here they come back, and something about their land is that it's heavily polluted. They have a different war going on. And their ancestors are the ones who were here to greet the Palatines, provided land and assistance, especially through that first winter. Now the Mohawks and Akwesasne have a environmental warfare. Just terrible diseases, chronic illnesses. You know, basically they're treated as if they are non-people. The reason why I bring this up is recently, and this was kind of a plan all along, but it took a lot to happen. Recently, this is the group that bought War Rangers. Yep. So some of you may be familiar with this. Well, in my series, especially Volume 1, I introduced it when people weren't really aware of what was happening. I follow them a little bit here and there throughout the series. And they bought foragers, so what they're doing is rematriating the land that their ancestors once lived on. Okay? Very interesting, very unique. So things are kind of coming full circle. Now they are the ones asking for help. I'm not here to ask for them, but the only help they really need is basically, volunteers. To be honest with you, they need people to help get that land rematriated as Mohawk, in the ways that their ancestors did. So it's going to become a cultural center. So really, what's interesting is I didn't know this when I was writing throughout this. I met them through the process, and now it's come full circle. Now the Palatine descendants are in a position to help the descendants of those who helped them. So it's a very interesting story, and that is it.
Thank you very much.
Now these are just some of the highlights. I can't possibly talk about this series, all of it, in one sitting. You saw how long it was just for one. I've had to pare that down a bit. But there are a lot of nuances here, a lot of factors. You're not just going to learn about Schoharie Valley history here. It's also Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, Algonquian, Mohican, but also Canadian history, New England history, Pennsylvania history, New Jersey history. There are lots of things here that are all connected to the Schoharie Valley. But that's, if you want to. I hope you do. All right, anybody have any questions? Yes?
So I should know this, but I guess I'm going to ask you because I know the Schoharie Valley, is that mostly woodland or cleared land?
Yeah. That's a question I've gotten a lot lately. I haven't, it's funny because things go in cycles. So you get questions at this point and questions at, I've heard this a lot lately, to be honest with you, and the way I think it was that prior to the 17th century, in the period of vacancy in which I talk about in the 17th century, prior to that, for over 9,000 or more years, there's almost near continuous occupation by indigenous people. And for the most part, you can't tell what culture they are until much later. I'll say about the year 1000, 1100. That's when you see your agricultural pursuits are, especially the Haudenosaunee. But through this whole period, you have transitional. It's transitional in a couple of different ways. Movement from the Susquehanna to the Hudson, but also transitional as far as culture goes. So, long story short, for at least, I'm going to say, 500 years or more before Europeans hit New York. Or at least I should say the Dutch, because the French were probably here 100 years before that. But for over 500 years, when there was an agricultural element to the Haudenosaunee and others, the land in the Schoharie Valley would have been cleared many times over. Reclaimed, and then again. Any trees that were there, which I believe most of it was probably grassland anyway, but if any trees were there would have been burned away by the indigenous people. That's how they clear land. So what you have is land that may have been at times reclaimed, overgrown, maybe smaller trees, not old growth, that Palatines might have had to clear in the better, in the flatlands. But you also wanted woodland. So a lot of these patents, especially the ones in the Mohawk, you got a certain amount of flatland and a certain amount of woodland, and they're distinct. So you say woodland and bottomland. So they're getting both. And that's what the Palatines and anybody else that went up the German Flats got. In the Schoharie Valley, it was more communal. They had their own plots, but they would just work them. You know, they didn't say, oh, these 50, you got to pay somebody for that. Those are your 50 acres, regardless of what it is. You always want woodland because you need wood for your shelter. You need wood for firewood. You also need the woodland to hunt in. So it's important. So if I was to reconstruct the Schoharie Valley, I would say most of what we know as the broad flats of the Schoharie Valley was probably mostly grassland by the time the Palatines arrived.
Nice.
Possibly overgrown because there wasn't much occupation there in the 17th century. So there might have been some things to clear, but nothing like a huge old growth forest. So in effect, it was easier for them to assimilate. And really the ability to know about the land and their close connection to it really made a strong bond with the Mohawks. That's key to their relationship, and relationship to any Haudenosaunee, because they both saw the land as sacred, just different ways. So that was a connecting point. Any other questions?
I got one.
Sure.
East Camp and West Camp, why were there 2 camps?
The 2 camps, well, you got the Hudson, okay?
Right.
Now, Livingston Manor, you ever been to Claremont? Claremont? That's Livingston Manor, except it's a different part of the Livingston Manor. It's the southern part. But you have the Hudson, you know where Claremont is, Germantown on the east side. That's where the east camps were. The west camp was basically where Saugerties is, in that area. So that's where those camps were. Most of the folks that came to the Schoharie Valley were from East Camp. And more than likely, they probably, I don't really get into this much because there's a lot of speculation here, but they probably came from Germany, from a certain area or district, not necessarily the same village, grouped together in their travels, were together in the camps, came over together on the same ship, ended up in the same camp, and then ended up in the same dwarf. If I was inclined to research that, which usually I leave that to genealogists, those are rabbit holes I'm not sure I want to get into. But if I was a betting man, I would say you could trace them all that way together, like that.
I just want to know the people of Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
why do they do that?
Well, the first thing is the Penn family was well known to basically want everybody. Didn't matter what your religion was. Now, the thing about this is that the Palatines were allowed to worship as they pleased. Lutheran, German, Reformed. Those were pretty well established churches in the New World, just not in this area. But they were able to worship. In fact, they shared the same church, or house for that matter, very often. And so religious freedom isn't really the thing. It's about Governor Keith having that meeting with Conrad Weiser Jr. and others where he said, oh, come to Pennsylvania, we got this land, you can get away from this land trouble. What he didn't tell them was you're going to have more over there. But the whole idea was is that they already had this idea in their head that land was there for them and it would be good, because it suggested through different documents that they sent scouts out just like they did to the Schoharie Valley from the camps. They sent scouts out to the Tulpehocken area because this would be on the extreme western frontier of Pennsylvania at the time. Now it's, eastern Pennsylvania, hard to distinguish between that and the suburbs of Philadelphia. But at the time, it was extreme western frontier, and it wasn't going to cost them anything. You got land there, you don't have to deal with these partners. Go out there. So many of them took their Keith's word, and he ends up being fraudulent. The Penn family kicked him, said you're no longer lieutenant governor a few years later. Kind of a mess. But they looked at it as hopefully the final promised land. They're always looking for that, ever since they left, the German provinces. And they probably thought that this was it. They wouldn't have to move any further. Because there really was no place to go further. Not really, other than the Indian country. Any other questions? No?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Excellent.
If anybody's interested, if you have further questions, or because you're shy or anything else like that, I'll stick around for a little while in case anybody wants any books. Feel free to pick one up, look through it, read through it. What I gave you is kind of a thumbnail sketch of some of the things that are out there. Many of them are much more nuanced as far as new information, new revelations, new analysis go. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
And we do have a few things to go over for membership for anybody